We're back. We're back. It's been a minute. Um, but here I am, It's been a few weeks since my last video. Nonetheless, here I am. In that journey for courage, we can only move forward. We can learn from the past, but we have to move on from it and engage in the moment that we are in. That is all we can do. Whenever we commit to things in our life, sometimes we'll fail, sometimes we'll succeed. But persist we must. So, I'm back here today. And the topic I'm going to talk about today, I'm inspired to introduce a concept that was brought up in a recent interview between Andrew Cuomo and the great philosopher Cornel West on Andrew Cuomo's podcast. In this interview, they discussed the idea of a philosopher-politician, a concept that has long escaped our current political process. The idea of a politician knowing their why. If we look to modern conversation, it's difficult to find a politician who stands by a philosophy, not just an ideology. The difference being the question of why. Why do you stand for what you stand for? How do the policies you support connect to your search for truth? Andrew Cuomo brought that up in the interview because Cornel West is running for president as an independent and is very much a philosopher. And it's kind of an idea, philosopher, well, the word philosophy is thrown around a lot and can have a lot of different meanings. But this idea of being a deep thinker and a politician at the same time has kind of escaped, at least in my opinion. You can make up your own opinion, but I think it's escaped our political process, and that's kind of Cornel West's why he's running, to kind of introduce that back, at least to be some sort of representative for what that would look like. He will probably not win, but it's bigger than that. He's doing it to represent that idea. And they note within the interview that those politicians, they had a cause, and that cause came from a place of authenticity and a deep search for truth within their own life and within their relationship to the world they were living in. As the election nears, and it looks ever more likely that we will have a rematch of the 2020 election, it is ever more important, I think, to ask these questions of ourselves and the candidates our system is presenting us with. And since it is January, and we recently celebrated Martin Luther King Day, I want to bring his light into this discussion. MLK has come to represent many different things in American culture, but as Cornel West points out in his book, The Radical King, none of these representations really get to the heart of who he was authentically and what type of force he was in our world. We kind of go back and forth between this, I have a dream that we won't see color anymore, and all people will be treated the same, and that's what represented him. Or this idea that he was purely a radical socialist in the marketplace and would push for simply progressive policies if he was alive today. It's deeper than that, as West notes. I just want to read the beginning of West's book. He introduces one quote in the beginning from Martin Luther King. As I have moved to break the betrayal of my own silences and to speak from the burnings of my own heart, many persons have questioned me about the wisdom of my path. At the heart of their concerns, this query has often loomed large and loud. Why are you speaking about the war, Dr. King? Why are you joining the voices of dissent? Peace and civil rights don't mix, they say. Aren't you hurting the cause of your people, they ask? And when I hear them, though I often understand the sources of their concern, I am nevertheless greatly saddened. For such questions mean that the inquirers have not really known me, my commitment, or my calling. I also just want to read the opening lines of his introduction. These are West's words. The FBI transcript of a June 27, 1964 phone conversation reveals Malcolm X receiving a message from Martin Luther King. This message supported the idea of getting the Human Rights Declaration of the United Nations to expose the unfair, vicious treatment of black people in America. Malcolm X replied that he was eager to meet Martin Luther King Jr. as soon as the next afternoon. If they had met that day and worked together, the radical King would be well known. In a speech to staff in 1966, King explained, "There must be a better distribution of wealth, and maybe America must move toward a democratic socialism. If he had lived and pursued this project, the radical King would be well known." On April 4th, 1968, in Memphis, the last day of his life, Martin Luther King phoned Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta with the title of his Sunday sermon, "Why America May Go to Hell." If he had preached this sermon, the radical King would be well known. Yet in Dr. King's own time, he would repeatedly say, "I am nevertheless greatly saddened that the inquirers have not really known me, my commitment, or my calling." I think this is so true. So I want to go into Cornel West's analysis of who King was. King was noted by the FBI as the most dangerous man in America at one time. Why? West asks the question, does America have the capacity to hear and heed the radical King, or must America sanitize King in order to evade and avoid his challenge? King had a dream, but it was not the American dream. It was rooted in the American dream. His dream, he believed, could come out of the American system, but it was not directly tied to the American dream that we think of. He called America a sick society, and at one point cried out in despair, "I have found out that all that I have been doing in trying to correct this system in America has been in vain. I am trying to get at the roots of it to see just what ought to be done. The whole thing will have to be done away with." Days before his death, he asked brother Harry Belafonte, "Are we integrating into a burning house?" West describes King as a blues man, fighting with pervasive love in a system that was unlikely to ever heed the reality he envisioned. West really likes this term, blues man, this idea of finding joy in the pursuit of a world, a better world, one in which you may never see, but nonetheless finding joy within it. For it is within the quest itself, not within the fruits. West calls on materialism to be a spiritual catastrophe. Clever gimmicks of mass distraction that yield a cheap soul craft of addicted and self-medicated narcissists. King declared that the U.S. government was the greatest portrayer of violence in the world today. In this, he was not trashing America, but telling a painful truth about a country he loved. West goes on, "Under the policies of the Obama administration and the National Security Agency, King could have been subject to detention without trial and assassination by executive decree for his links to terrorists of his day, such as Nelson Mandela." King believed that indifference to evil is more evil than evil itself, and materialism with its attendants, hedonism and egotism, produces sleepwalkers bereft of compassion and zombies deficient in love, and that this is rooted in the relative decline of integrity, honesty, decency, and virtue, due in large part to the role of big money in American life. King was not a Marxist nor a communist, but he did understand the role of class analysis in his focus on poor and working people. King declared, "I have come to think of my role as one which operates outside the realm of partisan politics. I feel I should serve as a conscience of all the parties and of all the people." So in this day of wanting to identify him with one side or the other, his time was no different. He was the object of criticism, of nationwide criticism at times, and nationwide support at times. but he did not see himself bound to a certain political party because he believed that truth operated outside of those things. West goes on to say, the dream of the radical king for the first black president surely was not a Wall Street presidency, drone presidency, and surveillance presidency, with a vanishing black middle class, devastated black working class, and desperate black poor people clinging to fleeting symbols and empty rhetoric. West asked President Obama during his 2008 campaign, what is the relation of your presidential policies to the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr.? In a conversation that lasted well over an hour, West was convinced that the relation was strong, and therefore he gave his support. However, after being on the campaign trail and witnessing 65 events from Iowa to Ohio, he said he knew most of his advisors were not a part of King's legacy, and Obama's betrayal of what the radical king stands for became undeniable. West goes on. The Obama apologists who hide and conceal Wall Street crimes, imperial crimes, new Jim Crow crimes, and surveillance lies in order to protect the first black president have much to account for. And a health care bill, Obamacare he's speaking of, a bonanza for big insurance and drug companies, along access to new consumers to manipulate. Those are my words, but this he believes fell short of the mark. West says, King was first and foremost a revolutionary Christian. King understood the good news to be primarily radical love in freedom and radical freedom in love. A fallible enactment of the beloved community or finite embodiment of the kingdom of God. This radical love of an intensely hated people is both liberating and contagious, in speaking of the black community. Just as this radical freedom of a thoroughly unfree people is both emancipating and infectious. West says that King was the most significant and effective organic intellectual in the latter half of the 20th century. His radical love was Christocentric in content and black in character. King's radical love put a premium on artistic performance and existential praxis. His sermons were performances that authorized an alternative reality to the way the world is. His living radiated a radical tenderness, subversive sweetness, and militant gentleness. He found great joy in serving others. Dr. King also understood radical love as a form of death, a relentless self-examination in which a fearful, hateful, egoistic self dies daily to be reborn into a courageous, loving, and sacrificial self. This radical love flows from an imitation of Christ, a response to an invitation of self-surrender in order to emerge fully equipped to fight for justice in a cold and cruel world of domination and exploitation. There is no radical king without his commitment to radical love. His revolutionary witness, he finishes and concludes the opening of the book. His revolutionary witness was grounded in his courage to think, his courage to love, and his courage to die. Could it be that we know so little of the radical king because such courage defies our market-driven world? I think this representation of King is so different than what we consider today, and even in what we debate about online, even within this world of information where we have the ability to create our own avenues of conversation. We don't include this sort of deep understanding of him. And not only that, how much does our world today crave the authenticity of somebody like King, or even West? I'm not supporting him necessarily, but somebody with the ability to know why they're fighting for the policies that they're promoting, right? I think so much of today is, how quickly do you see our politicians switch sides on issues 5-10 years later because the tide has shifted that's a result of institutionalized politicians. Politician as a job, right? It's not this sort of service that it was meant to be founded upon. And you don't have to agree with everything that I just read about West and his description of King. You don't have to. But what must be acknowledged is that the deepness with which King evaluated the world is not seen in our modern political landscape. Trump and Biden don't represent that. Whether or not there are avenues for that, I think is left to be decided. I think we have the ability to have that deeper discussion. And I hope we do. But just wanted to update. Just wanted to, how's my roommate? It's awkward when you're recording a video talking to yourself and somebody else comes in. I just wanted to put that out there. Thoughts for Friday. I don't know. I don't really know what I'm talking about. We all need humility in these conversations. So I definitely don't have the full lens of what it requires to get to the heart of all of our disagreements. But I think, as Chris Cuomo said on his interview with West, I think, which I'll put in the description in the chat, the link to it. What we need is not a broadening of our discussion, but a deepening. And I think all Americans, at least the vast majority of Americans, would look to MLK as somebody we look up to, somebody we want to emulate. But our representations of him often do not match that which he was. And there may be a reason for that. There may be a reason that we don't know the extent of his radical ideas because they were a threat to the system in which we live. But they were so different than what we talk about. It wasn't some sort of ushering some communist age in or ushering some age of conservatism or progressivism. It was attached to love and what the possibility of true fellowship and authenticity, the waves that could make in the world. I don't think it was necessarily, I don't even know if he had a vision of exactly what that world would look like. Because I think that's the faith within his ideology. The faith is in, we know what it takes to move forward, but we do not necessarily know what that will look like in the end. On that note, have a great weekend.